Are we having fun yet? Great. Phoenix, Arizona is now the country's 5th largest and fastest growing city, doubling its population in the last 20 years. This Sunbelt metropolis named itself after the mythical bird that arose from its ashes to symbolize death and rebirth. Recently, the city's warp speed sprawl over the fragile Sonoran Desert began unearthing a cautionary tale of history being reborn. As Craig Childs reported in the High Country News, because the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act demands an audit of digging around archaeological sites, the construction boom is revealing a ghostly mirror image, a failed prior civilization built along virtually identical lines of development. The empire of the Neolithic people who once lived in this Salt River Valley expanded until they could no longer sustain themselves. They're known as the Hohokam. It's a Pima Indian word, and it means all used up. As Childs pointed out, when archaeologists study the Hohokam, they see a civilization that finally collapsed under the weight of drought, overpopulation, and ensuing disarray. When they look at Phoenix, they see the same. The Hohokam's unbridled growth finally met its match with climate change. They deserted their last remaining settlements in the 15th century. New settlers blithely built over their ruins and eventually called it Phoenix. The city's endless new construction sites fly cheerful banners flapping with environmental bromides such as think, build, and live sustainably, and the future looks green. Indeed, the city has enacted groundwater management regulations that are relatively progressive, and it's starting to put in light rail and public transportation. Green buildings are springing up despite Paleolithic regulations. Will it be a stitch in time? It's worth remembering the Hohokam lasted for 1,500 years. Phoenix has 1,450 years to go. Green builder John Abrams says we need to redesign not just the architecture of our homes and our buildings, but of our communities and our businesses. He says we need to start thinking like the cathedral builders who knew their work could not be completed in one lifetime. John builds things to last. He got his start 30 years ago when he and his partner built a house for themselves and a few friends in Vermont for about $500. It quickly led to other jobs. They never intended to start a company. They just loved what they did. Word of their artistry and craftsmanship soon propelled South Mountain into steady demand. And when John built a house on his beloved home island of Martha's Vineyard, despite getting high-paying offers for jobs all over the country, he realized he wanted to dedicate his efforts to making a difference in one place, his own beloved backyard. Over the decades, he's built not just ecologically intelligent buildings, but also a remarkable employee-owned company woven into a close-knit community that's trying to pull together for the long haul. His work elegantly combines high-quality green building with sustainable energy, community development, and workplace democracy. John's South Mountain Company won the Business Ethics Magazine's 2005 National Award for Workplace Democracy. He's the author of the great book, The Company We Keep, Reinventing Small Business for People, Community, and Place. His only roaming off Martha's Vineyard is to speak and teach about good business, relocalizing the economy, solving the affordable housing crisis, and creating a positive future. Of course, 30 years ago, John did not know that green building would move from ridicule to cool. He did not know it would become a crucial strategy for mitigating climate change. He did not know that architects in the construction industry are responsible for half America's energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and almost 2/3 of electricity consumption. No one knew that green building would go mainstream, from state-of-the-art New York City skyscrapers to the design policies of entire cities. What John Abrams has long known is how to think like a cathedral builder. He knows expanding our time horizon expands the possibilities and will let us rise from the ashes yet again. So please join me in welcoming a modern cathedral builder, John Abrams.
Thanks so much, Kenny. That was a wonderful introduction. I guess we'll have to wait a couple of hundred years to see what happens to Phoenix. You know, Arlo Guthrie was once playing on my island, and he was talking during a show about songwriting, and he said songwriting is kind of like sitting by a river, and you just watch the good lines go by, and you pluck them out when the good ones are there. And he said, let me give you a piece of advice. He said, never, if you do this, never sit downstream from Bob Dylan. And my advice to you is never talk after Judy Wicks. Isn't she wonderful? As Kenny mentioned, I've lived on the island of Martha's Vineyard for 32 years, but it's quite special to be here today because from 1953 to 1958, I lived in the town of Ross, here in Marin, just a few miles away. From our house on Madrona Avenue, I could ride my bike to Lagunitas and up to Phoenix Lake and find crayfish and tadpoles and frogs in the creek. Going down Madrona, it was a short ride to the Ross School and Main Street, just beyond, anchored for me by Eddie's grocery store where the Twinkies and the Snickers were, and Mrs. Sullivan's variety store where the toys were. My mom grew artichokes, and the huge blackberry patch between our house and the neighboring Pikes was responsible for staining most of my clothes. I left my Daisy air gun in the rear bumper of my dad's powder blue 52 Buick, and when he went to do his volunteer work at San Quentin, the guards found it and chewed him out. In third grade, my best friend's mother paid me $25 a week to get him to stop sucking his thumb in class. I did little to earn it. And the father of my first girlfriend, Joan Goodman, owned a lumberyard just off 101 in Mill Valley. It's still there, 50 years later. I loved driving by it this morning, but I was particularly impressed when I was a kid by how this lumberyard stood there all alone, no more. From Phoenix to Marin is not so very far. But I have an infinite number of memories from those times, and memories, of course, evoke powerful emotions. So does hope. I want to tell a story about hope. It's kind of a long story about an old friend of mine, a hard luck guy named Lou. When we met in 1973 in southern Vermont, I quickly came to know that he had a wondrous green thumb. More than anything, he loved to grow things. He also loved, at that time, a woman named Susan. Soon after we met, she left him for somebody else. It hit him hard, and he decided to go work on the Alaska pipeline, then in construction, to make money to buy a farm. Just 2 weeks before he left, he fell in love with someone else, a woman named Dorothy. After a whirlwind couple of weeks, he left his plan, but now with another plan. Dorothy would join him in Alaska once he got settled. He arrived in Alaska, called home to Vermont, and he was told that Dorothy had fallen off a horse, hit her head on a rock, and died. Distraught now and feeling cursed, he threw himself into his work, going 2 shifts on the pipeline for 2 years, socking away an amazing amount of money for those times. And he decided to trek around the world in search of the Garden of Eden, to find the place where he would buy land, settle, and grow things. Lou was in a bus in Indonesia when it was involved in a devastating accident. Most of the passengers were killed. Lou was alive. And as the scene unfolded and chaos prevailed, a white guy driving a Jeep from a nearby Goodyear plantation saw another white guy writhing in this sea of dark bodies. He stopped and put Lou in the back of his truck and drove him to the plantation hospital, from where he was airlifted to a hospital in Australia and recovered from multiple life-threatening injuries, but was in the hospital for 6 months. While there, he fell in love again. This time with a doctor in the hospital named Carrie. They were married, they remained in Australia, and raised 2 daughters there. Over several decades, Lou's brother, an investment broker, handled the money that Lou had earned on the pipeline, which grew to staggering proportions. Lou finally found, almost a quarter century later, the perfect piece of land, the Garden of Eden in Australia. He was finally ready to buy. The last time I saw him, some years ago, was just after he went to New York to see his family and pick up his money. And in New York, he found that all of his money, every penny, had gone up his brother's nose. So he came to see us, to lick his wounds and get over his anger. He said when he learned from his brother what he had done, he stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether he should beat him senseless, ready to kill. But instead, he turned around, walked out the door, and came to see us. After a few days, he was starting to feel better. He said, you know, I can get over this. I've gotten over worse. He told us that when he was in Australia, in the hospital, he recovered well from all his wounds, except that the healing of his right leg, which had been horribly broken, left him with very bad foot drop. As he walked, his foot dragged. It was a big blow, after all the pain and healing, to be left with this disability. The doctor said they'd done all that they could. This is the way it would be. But not Carrie, the doctor he had met, who would become his wife. She had a different take. She said, what are you planning to do? Mope around for the rest of your life? You can decide to get better. Nobody can get you better except you. You have to decide to do what you want. He decided to get better. He worked on his foot for 2 years, many, many hours every day, tedious, painful work. And at the beginning, it got better, but then he reached a plateau that lasted 6 months. He gave up. Carrie said, why are you giving up? You've worked so hard. He kept going. After 2 years, he was 100% as good as new, back on the basketball court, which he'd loved as a kid growing up in Queens. And he said to us, if I could do that, I can get over this. I think about Lou often, about the simple fact that not only can we do what we want, but that if we don't insist on the future we want and commit ourselves completely and unequivocally to that future, we condemn ourselves to the future we get. It gives me hope to think that way. Václav Havel once said, hope is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart, an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope is the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. What I'd like to talk about today is something that gives me great hope, something I am certain makes sense, no matter how it turns out, and that is the practice and limitless promise of employee ownership and workplace democracy. There are so many hopeful things I could talk about, so many aspects of my work and the work of others, but in this short time, I can talk about only one. Now, when I was originally asked to give this talk, I thought I wanted to talk about something I speak about often, the power of long-term thinking, thinking like cathedral builders, as Kenny said, but I changed my mind. I hope you'll accept my capriciousness. Is this okay? Well, there's a reason for my choice, and that's that I've come to the conclusion that for the modest successes I've found in my work, the foundation, the fuel, the inspiration for all of it is the profound ethic of employee ownership and all that spills from it and grows out of it. The employee-owned workplace is, in my view, the spawning ground for multi-generational cathedral building. Marjorie Kelly, in her book, The Divine Right of Capital, says, Thomas Paine's vision of every man a proprietor is a worthy ideal to own one's own place of work. But in this era, most citizens are necessarily employees and always will be. We need a new economic vision for a new era, not every man a proprietor, but every employee an owner. I was rummaging through some old papers not long ago, and I found a letter that I want to read you, dated December 16th, 1968, 39 years ago. The letter reads, Dear John, when you have the $15 you owe me from the time I bought the grass from you, you can send it to Ann Vibert, 642 East 11th Street, New York City. This was before there were zip codes. And it goes on to say, I expect this sounds like a pressure-type note. It's not meant to me. Just send it when you have it. Thanks. Sincerely, Ann Vibert. Well, I read this and I thought, you know, I have the money now. I should really pay back my debt. So I searched the internet and found one Ann Vibert that was about the right age, and she's a professor at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. So I popped a $100 bill into an envelope, a little bit of interest, and sent it off with a copy of the letter. 2 weeks later, a letter came back with the $100 bill in it, and it said, "John, much as I appreciate the gesture and as much delight as it brought to my day, I'm afraid I can't lay claim to the identity of the apparently other Ann Vibert. In 1968, I was 13 and living in a small town in Nova Scotia where grass was still only something to mow. Keep searching. She'll be thrilled." It was signed Ann Vibert, the other one. But I tell you this because there's a question here. And the question is, if I sold her the pot, how come I owed her money? And I've come to think that this may be a parable for my career in business. Not many years after that, I was in business, although I didn't mean to be, and it was hardly worthy of the term. We were building houses on Martha's Vineyard and losing money on every job we did. There was a defining moment for me, which happened when a dear friend and mentor who closely followed our work came to visit, and we were touring our projects, which he admired tremendously, and he said, "It's good, it's beautiful work. Are you making any money?" I said, "No way." And he said, "Well, this is a nice idea, Abrams. I mean, it's novel anyway, subsidized housing for the rich." And this blunt assessment triggered in me the realization that I needed to sort out my priorities, learn about business, and determine what it really means to me. In 1987, 20 years after Ann Vibert sent me that letter, and 20 years ago, my company, South Mountain Company, restructured from a sole proprietorship under my ownership to an employee-owned cooperative corporation. It was a dramatic hinge point in the history of the company. Ownership has become available to all employees, enabling people to own and guide their workplace. The responsibility, the power, and the profits all belong to the group of owners. There are no outside investors. There are no non-employee owners. We decide what kind of business ours will be. The decisions are partly economic and partly philosophical. Now, at the time of the restructuring, the full implications of what I was doing were not apparent to me. I was frightened, but I was energized. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I was drawn to it. Some wonder why I gave up sole ownership and control, but only because they don't understand the tremendous rewards and benefits that derive from that decision for me and for the company. I have the best job I can imagine, due to the colleagues who share ownership and share this ride. And the potential freedom that we can gain is alone a compelling reason why you may wish to sell your business to your employees. You still get to own it, partly. You still get to run it, partly. And yet you're freed from full responsibility, partly. Employee ownership is truly emerging from beneath the radar. Today, over 11,000 companies in this country with 8.5 million employees have some form of employee ownership. And in fact, today, more Americans work in firms partly or wholly owned by employees than are members of unions in the private sector. Most of these companies do not share our cooperative model, and most do not distribute power fully. They mostly distribute money, partly. But all indicate that we may be learning something fundamental. Now, since the publication of my book, The Company We Keep, I've become more aware, thanks to feedback I've received, of the degree of interest in our model. And I'm more convinced than ever that employee ownership has a part to play in leading us toward a restorative future. I'd like to speculate about a few reasons why employee ownership may be appealing to more and more business people. The inherent injustice of our current economic system, all wealth goes to the owner or the shareholders, can be tackled through employee ownership by shifting the wealth to the real stakeholders, the people that are creating the wealth. And if the people who make the decisions are the people who will bear the consequences of those decisions, better decisions are likely to result. Accountability is woven into the fabric of this system. Now, when the employees who live in the community and are part of the civic landscape are making the decisions, it's less likely the business will be sold because people don't want to move. It's more likely that it will stay rooted in place, and there's more incentive to be a positive force in the community. We're part of the place we're raising our children, and we have a long-term commitment to it. Ethnobiologist Gary Paul Nabin, writing in Cultures of Habitat, examines side by side 2 color-coded county-by-county maps of the United States. The first displays the relative duration of human residency within each county. The second tallies the endangered species. Overlapping the 2 maps, he finds a near-perfect alignment where people stayed put longer, fewer plants and animals had become endangered. This suggests a relationship between community stability and biological diversity, or by extension, between human culture and ecological well-being. Institutions that foster less mobility could help the journey to restoration. Another, employee ownership can be a solution to the brain drain problem. Do you find it as unsettling as I do that tens of thousands of our brightest people are working in hedge funds and investment banks and in private equity firms and producing nothing, absolutely nothing except money? Is it because the lack of meaning and ownership in our work drives us to want to make money more than anything else? Could widespread workplace democracy alter this dynamic? Employee ownership encourages a sense of empowerment and promises deeper connections, greater commitment, increased productivity. A friend of mine, Robert Lever, has taught me something about power that transcends, I think, the way most people think about power. Most people think that power is like a pie. If I give you a slice, now you've got some and I've got less. Power, as Robert says, is infinite. If we distribute power, there's not less for us, there's just more power, more available for every one of us. Employee ownership is about extending power to each and every one of us, expanding that power, simple as that. I think our cultural understanding of this concept may be on the rise. One key element of our approach is hiring future owners as opposed to employees. We envision people who enter the company staying and leading it forward. We don't know what they, as the perpetuators, will do or produce, but the essence of our collective enterprise will survive in them as they travel into a future that we can't even imagine. So we're not always looking for people with specific skill sets. We can teach what we need to. We're looking for the kind of people we wish to share ownership with. This attracts people. Ownership is a very big deal. As Tom Friedman once said, in the history of mankind, nobody has ever washed a rented car. But Corey Rosen, the director of the National Center for Employee Ownership, says, but it's not about giving a sense of ownership. Offering a sense of ownership is like offering a hungry person a sense of dinner. In this case, it's about the whole meal. Another thing about employee ownership is that it is the ticket to good legacy and smooth transitions. By sharing ownership early on, the difficult question that comes when founders are ready to retire, what to do with this business that we've put heart and soul into and often half a lifetime. I see this with so many of my contemporaries grappling with this issue right now. It's taken care of. Currently at South Mountain, we're engaged in the exhilarating work of transitioning from Generation 1 to Generation 2. There's a new group of young, sharp, passionate employees whose journey it will be to take us beyond what we, the first group of owners, has been able to accomplish. But I don't want to overfreight the ownership part. Employee ownership is a vehicle. It's hardly the only one that encourages more responsible and democratic business practices. In the end, it's not about the package, but about the contents. And it requires a major cultural shift and requires education. When people pay the South Mountain members fee and sign the ownership documents, they become legal owners, but they're owners only in part. It's like walking out of the attorney's office just after closing on a new piece of property. You may own it, but it's not truly yours until you've experienced a sunset, a full moon, a downpour, a swarm of mosquitoes, a gusty day in the fall, an ice storm. It's not yours until you've come to know the trees and the shrubs, until you've tended the garden. The property is not yours, in fact, until you've confronted at least one skunk on the path to the front door. That's how it is with employee ownership. You don't take ownership, you're not given ownership. Work experiences and shared decisions accumulate within each individual, gradually making the company his or hers. The skunk on the pathway heightens our senses as we tiptoe down the path to ownership. Tending this garden and taking responsibility for stewardship of a diverse set of commitments makes cooperative ownership real. But nothing's all peaches and cream. Our struggle with our values is ongoing. There's a story about Abe Lincoln when he was still practicing law in Springfield, Illinois, and he represented a client who was fighting the railroad. A friend of Lincoln's was approaching his office, and he saw a man come flying out the window, hit the ground, brush himself off, and run down the street. And the friend rushed in to see what had happened, and Lincoln said, "I threw him out the window." Well, why? What did he do? Well, he's the lawyer for the railroad, and he offered me $5,000 to betray my client, but I turned him down. Then he offered me $10,000. I turned him down. Finally, he offered me $15,000. I threw him out the window. And the friend asked why. He chose that moment to throw him out because, Lincoln said, he was getting close to my price. The lure of greater financial success can be strong and hard to forego, and sometimes it comes close to our price. But 30 years after our seat-of-the-pants beginnings, we're still small enough to stay closely connected to our roots, to do business on a handshake, to all gather in one small room, to know each other as people and not only as coworkers, to recognize one another as collaborators in pursuit of multiple goals. Living our structure has shaped a dedicated, skillful, compassionate body of decision makers. Nobody's getting rich, but we're living comfortably doing the work we enjoy in the location of our choice. All of us are able to make good livelihoods because no one of us is getting rich. Let me conclude, and I only have a minute, by suggesting to you one avenue of change. William Grider, in The Soul of Capitalism, calls the Homestead Act of 1862, which awarded free land if the recipients worked on it and stayed on it, to more than 500,000 American families, a public works project of grandly egalitarian intent that was probably the nation's greatest single stroke of economic development channeled directly through people. So, my hope is something I want from our next president. Who's it going to be? Barack Obama? Al Gore? Dennis Kucinich? We could have co-presidents. How about Kenny and Nina as co-presidents? How about Presoneers in 08? Well, whoever it's going to be, I hope that he or she or they will propose the Workstead Act of 2010. About 4 million Americans are born each year. If at birth, 20,000 were invested for each baby, it would become 70,000 at age 25. That 70,000 would be available to each young citizen to invest in the business of their choice after becoming an employee. Depending on how you figure, it would take only a 10% reduction in military spending to do this, or a tiny rise in the taxes of wealthy Americans. How good would it be for American business, for capitalism, if every new employee was an investor? How good would it be for business if our children were the new source of venture capital? If they were, what would they invest in? Do you think, as I do, that they would want to own businesses they believe in, businesses designed to make a better world? if many did, this would be a change of epic proportions, a change to the fundamental chemistry of our culture. I hope to see the day. I hope you do too, and thank you so much.
Thanks, and have a great weekend.